today we're going to actually go to Acts 20. We're actually going to go to Acts 27, 29 through 44. And some people, whoever did and I wasn't here, I was here for part of last week. And when it was covered last week, you find us, well, let me see, I know both of you, were both of you here last week?
Yeah.
No, only for a portion.
Okay. So, Deacon, can you give us kind of a brief kind of update on what happened, where we are?
We, let me see. We still, okay. Let me go back here. We were, I think we were talking about how they were heading through the islands there, if I can remember right.
Right.
Then they were taking the soundings there, phantoms, and they were fearing kind of like the wind, I believe, and they were seeking to escape from the ship. And what I see, Paul and the centurions,
Northeastern.
and the northeastern wind there. And that's about it for me.
Yeah, that's close. I mean, that's close enough. What really happens is Paul now has to go sail to Rome.
Yeah.
And in that process, they run into a storm.
Yeah, they went to a bad.
I heard it. Somebody said it. They ran into a bad what?
Went into in the area in the sea that was normally rough. It was a rough area that was normally rough in that certain area that they were sailing through. And I think they decided to go another route or something. I could be wrong on that.
Well, they did. They decided they were going to go, and where they went, they ran into this storm.
Yes.
And the storms are typically in that area pretty rough, but this was a even rougher storm than normal.
And that was during the time, I think Mr. Kennebrew explained to us. It's hard for me to pronounce that name. That what was that, Mr. The
Northeastern.
Northeast, it's an upper what?
Etesian. It's like Etesian winds. It came from the northwest coming down, and it was going contrary to where they were going. So that's why it was rough, very rough, turbulent.
And it usually happened during, I think, through September or during that time.
Yeah,
right, September to November, you could travel, but after November, it's basically you shouldn't be traveling in those waters at all the way up to like March.
So rough seas. It's funny, you guys are talking about that, and I'm thinking, here at my house, typically the storms that come up, they come from behind the house and they go from the back of the house to the front of the house in that direction. But when a storm comes in our neighborhood and it comes from the front of the house, we know it's going to be bad. It's going to be a bad wind. It's going to do some damage. It's going to be a strong storm because it's coming from a direction that it doesn't normally come from, which is from the north, and it's dropping in on us. And so it's typically bringing some really harsh winds with it. And they're usually really, really fast. But that's when we start to see real damage and tornadoes, because our wind patterns are from the back of my house to the front. So when the wind comes from the front to the back, those two air masses meet, and that's violent. That causes violent storms. And so that's how we kind of know here when it's going to be bad. And so here we have this group. They're setting sail for Rome. They run into a pretty bad storm area. And so in 29, let me see if I can make this a hot movie. In 29, we pick up in Acts 27, verse 29, it says, fearing that we would be dashed against the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight. And so it's funny that this would be the beginning of what we're talking about. But this concept of being dashed against the rocks just means that there was a lot of rocks. I don't know how familiar each of us are with ships, but the bottom of a ship goes a certain depth into the water. And if you're ever looking at a ship and you see the bottom of the ship is typically a color, and then the side of it is a different color, that lowest color is typically the water line, and it lets them know how deep the ship is riding in the water. And so that way they can determine how deep the water has to be for the ship to be able to go in certain places. And so they've got to figure that out. Today we have sonar. We send the sound down, and then the sound comes back up, and the length of time that it takes for it to come back up tells us how deep the water is. So they had a system that they were using that let them know that the water went from 150 feet and now it was at 90. And they were worried that they were about to run ashore. So in order to stop a ship from moving, how many anchors do we normally drop? Anybody know?
1.
Ooh, you know that.
Huh?
Yours.
I can't hear you. I didn't hear you. I'm sorry.
I said, you know that, and you said it with confidence. Why do you say 1?
Well, because everything's kind of calm, but sometimes you have to drop 2.
Oh, so what would make you have to drop 2, Deacon Burt?
Well, if the water's, depending on, like, say, I believe how many fathoms, and then if you got rough waters where you're anchoring it.
See, there it is. A boat, if you put a boat and you put 1 anchor down, that boat can make a circle.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It can move in a circle.
Right.
It can, the front part of wherever that anchor is mounted to the boat will go so far, but then the back of that boat can swing around in a big circle. And so when you're worried about how deep the water is, you don't want that boat to go in a circle. You want that boat to sit still. So you drop 1 in the front and you drop 1 in the back. And that way the boat can just go side to side, but it can't, in a little bit forward and a little bit back, but it can't turn in a circle. So you've got more control of the boat. So if you drop 4 anchors, which is a bit excessive, you're trying to make sure the boat doesn't move at all. But there's a couple things you need to know about an anchor. An anchor doesn't necessarily stop a boat from moving. An anchor is designed to be a heavy weight that grabs the bottom of the ocean and grabs onto a structure on the bottom of the ocean that it can dig into, that then would hold the whole boat still. So if the anchor drops and there is nothing down there for it to grab onto, the boat can be pushed away into different places. Even with the anchor down, a boat can be pushed. So in this case, they're saying that fearing that they would be dashed against the rocks, they could see the rocks and they were doing everything they could do to try to avoid it. Now, common sense says if they can see rocks, then rocks are underneath them, right? That's just kind of a common sense thing, because rocks are typically on top of rocks. Even though there might be some sand, there's probably some rock structure underneath. And so they were hoping that one, if not all 4 of those anchors would grab onto a rock and hold the boat steady. And then my favorite thing happens. But they said something really interesting. They said they dropped 4 anchors from the stern. And so what that suggests is that whatever conditions they were in, The stern is the back of, is which part of the boat, Deacon?
Is that the rear?
You got the aft and the stern. The aft is the rear, the stern is the front. So they drop these anchors in the front to keep that boat from going head first into what they thought was a rocky structure. So they will try anything they can do to stop it from going forward for them, what is forward in the boat. And then they said, and then they prayed for daylight. They prayed for daylight. Wow. So what time was it that they recognized they were in trouble? Night. They recognized it was at night that they were having this problem when you can't really see, and it's very difficult to figure things out. So, and they prayed for daylight. I won't go back into Wednesday's discussions the last 2 weeks, but this concept of daylight, just if you watch that, just remember we're now they're praying for light, right? They're praying to God for light, for daylight. All right. Let me see if I can get it to move. Which one? All right, that didn't do it. So we did it. All right. So now we get to Acts 27, 30 and 32. It says, in an attempt to escape from the ship, the sailors let the lifeboat down into the sea, pretending they were going to lower some anchors from the bow. They've done some from the stern, 4 of them, in fact, and now they're pretending to put some in the back. Then Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved. So the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboat and let it drift away. So the other thing I need to go back and just clarify for us is that we're now on a ship with a bunch of soldiers and a bunch of prisoners. It's important for you guys to know that if ever a prisoner escaped, the consequence of the prisoner escaping was death to the soldier that allowed him to escape. I need you to hear me. If ever a prisoner escaped, the consequence to the soldier who was responsible for the prisoner was death. You could never lose a prisoner. And so now we have this situation here where the water's, it's bad, it's into the night, and we see that the sailors have gotten so afraid that they're going to leave. They're convinced whoever stays on this boat is going to die. So they're going to try to get off the boat and let the people on the boat die. And it says, the sailors let the lifeboat down into the sea. I have a picture of a lifeboat. It's interesting to me that they cut it away. The only source they had other than the giant ship that could get them to the land safely, they cut it away. And they cut it away so that nobody would take that thing and get off the boat because they needed everybody. And what's even more interesting is that Paul, who is a prisoner, goes to the centurion and the soldiers and starts to lead them. Paul's a prisoner. He's supposed to be on the boat being a prisoner. Shut up, sit down, eat when I tell you to eat, walk when I tell you to walk, talk when I tell you to talk. Don't do anything I don't tell you to do. Prisoner. And yet he goes to the centurion and says something to him. And he says, unless these men stay, you cannot be saved. And so the soldiers the soldiers cut the ropes to the only way that the people could escape. And basically said to them, we will live and die together, whether you like it or not, because there is no other way for you to get off this boat. Right? Powerful, Paul, the prisoner. 33 through 34, Acts 27, 33 through 34. And then just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat. This is one of my favorite scenes. For the last 14 days, he said, you have been in constant suspense and have gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. Now I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head. So now Paul jumps into his prophetic. Now we understand why Paul is able to lead these men. Because Paul is anointed in this moment to lead. He understands that he still has a mission and he has to go to Rome. And anybody that stays with him has to survive because he has to survive because God has told him he's going to Rome. But it's interesting to me here that Paul decides it's time to eat. And notice the timing of the meal. Just before dawn. So it's still dark, right? It's still the most serious and scary time because they still can't see how far and how close they are from land. And yet Paul says, hey, I know you're scared. I know you're nervous. I know you're worried. You guys have got to eat. And then he goes on to tell them that for 14 days, 2 cycles of completion, for 14 days, you have not eaten. You've been on constant suspense. You have gone without food. You got to eat. But then he proclaims to them, not one of you will lose a single hair from your head. Not one. How can you say that when you're in the middle of this ocean on a ship that's doing what it wants to do, that's really controlled by the wind? You only have tools that allow you to access the wind, but not necessarily control it. The wind, the ship is still at the mercy of the winds and the rocks and the water. They don't have a motor. See, today we have a motor. You know, if we go back to that first picture, I don't know if I can or not. When we go back to this picture, this boat had a motor. And so it could turn its motor on, aim away from the rocks and turn it on full speed and have a shot. It couldn't even do it with a motor. Now, Paul's boat doesn't even have a motor. It's more like that thing, right? It doesn't have a motor on it. Whatever happens, it's the wind that'll do it. And so he tells them, though, don't worry. Not one hair on your head, okay, will be harmed. All right, now we get to the heart of it. Acts 27:35-37. He says, after he said this, he took some bread and gave thanks to God in front of them all. Then he broke it and began to eat. Okay. Any similarities there to anything that you've seen before?
Like the Last Supper.
Whoa. The Last Supper. Right? He starts the process of the Last Supper. Remember, part of Paul's message in Acts is to help us understand that his journey and our journey as Christians, to some degree, will parallel what happens to Jesus. I know this gets a little, this challenges some of our perspectives, or some of the things we've been taught over time. And so every time it comes out of my mouth that you're a little God, some people twist and turn. I get an email or a text message. But again, as a little God, some of your life will parallel that of Jesus, of Jesus. That was the point of Jesus coming, to help us understand some of the things that we would go through and what it would look like to go through those things, so that we would have an anchor point, a place from which we won't be able to move, which is why I'm so thrilled by this concept of them dropping an anchor, because it really means that they're trying to find a spot from which nothing will change. This spot will anchor me in one spot. And he says to them right here, he says, let's have a Passover meal. Let's redo the Lord's Supper. And they were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. See, Paul had decided whether y'all are going to eat or not, I'm going to do the Last Supper. I am going to break this bread and I am going to give thanks and I am going to eat it. I am sure that my God is going to show up and fix this. And in that moment, he was able to encourage the Romans on the ship who don't necessarily believe in Jesus. In fact, don't believe, we're fairly certain don't believe in Jesus, but they became encouraged and ate some food themselves. And then it goes on to give us some insight. It says, altogether, there were 276 of us on board. Now, I'm going to play with something here. I had a calculator. Let me get mine out again, just so we can all do this together. If you take your calculator and you take this out and you take this number that you see right there, which is 276, if you take, and this is where it gets really interesting, if you take 12 times 12 disciples, 12 times 12, it's 144. If you double that, it's 288. Okay? So if you take 12 times 12 times 2, you get 288. If you subtract 12 disciples from that, you get 276. This whole numerology that takes place in the Bible is always in specific sets. And there's a couple books out there that talk a lot about the numbers that you see. But I want you to see the numbers that are used to create some of these numbers. 276 is 12 times 12, 12 disciples, times 12 disciples will get you 144. If you double that times 2, that'll get you 288. And if you subtract 12 from it, it'll get you 276. The 12 is an interesting number that I won't go into detail today about, but is an interesting number because it does talk about our disciples, even though we know that there were significantly more than 12, there were 12 primaries that we talk about. But he says there were 276 of us on board. When all 276 had eaten as much as they wanted, they lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea. Now, you can take that one of two ways. There is this one way that says, if we throw everything off the boat, what it does is it lightens the ship and raises it up in the water so it gets closer to land before it crashes into the land. So lightening the ship allows it to become raised up. And remember, I told you in the beginning, if you look at the bottom of the ship, you'll typically see the bottom of the ship has a color line, a line on it, and then it goes all the way around the hull that way. Well, you can look at that line and see how high or low you're riding in the water. The less of the line you see, the deeper your bottom is in the water. The more of the color you see, the shallower your boat is riding in the water. So what they were trying to do is get the boat to be shallow, really, really, really high in the water, so they could get closer to the land before they crashed. Oh, that won't work. How about this? All right. Yeah, could you slow down? All right. Acts 24, 39 through 41. Here we go again. When daylight came, when the light showed up, right? They did not recognize the land. I want you to understand what's happening here. Remember, I told you that even when you put an anchor down, it doesn't necessarily stop the boat from moving. And so when daylight came and they could see, they recognized that they did not recognize where they were. It's kind of polar opposite of what Christopher Columbus did, right? Christopher Columbus set sail, got all the way to what he called the New World, did not recognize that he didn't know where he was, and called it something that he thought it was, right? Well, they recognized immediately, I'm in the wrong place. I don't know where this is. But they did see a bay with a sandy beach. Now that's a key. When you start to see lots of sand, you know that there are less rocks because of the sand. And so he says, they saw a bay with the sandy beach where they decided to run the ship aground if they could, meaning they were going to try to now run that ship where they had been trying to keep the anchors down to keep them from going into the water or into the land. They now wanted to run into the land because it was sand and it was soft, right? So they cut loose the anchors, the 4 anchors. They left them in the sea. They didn't even pull them up. They just cut the ropes at the boat, at the top of the boat, because they knew they weren't going to be using this boat anymore. They were getting ready to beach it. Typically when a boat beaches, it's no longer useful. The structure, the bottom of the boat is so severely damaged that it's not seaworthy, and so they won't use it anymore. So they just cut the ropes and said, all right, here we go, full speed. In the sea and untied the ropes that held the rudders. So they had also been keeping the rudders still so that they couldn't move the boat away, move the boat into the land. Now they're going to let them go and just let the boat go. And then on top of that, they then hoisted the foresail to the wind and made for the beach. That means they pulled the big sail up so that it would catch the wind and grab it and drive it right into the beach. They wanted to hit it as fast as they could, as quick as they could, because the faster and harder they did it, the closer to the beach they would get, right? And the less dangerous the swim might be. And if they were really lucky, they might be able to get all the way to the beach. And so they hoisted the foresail and made for the beach. But the ship struck a sandbar and ran aground. I don't know if you've ever been to North Carolina or not, but if you ever go to North Carolina, there's a lot of beaches like this. You will look out into the water in certain places, especially if you go to Myrtle Beach, and about a half a mile out in the water, you'll notice no boats come any closer than that. And that's because there's a giant sandbar out there. And that sandbar prohibits boats from getting into the coast, into the beach front. And it's not always man-made. That one happens to be partially man-made. But most of the time, they're not man-made. They're just made by a breaking point, and that's where sand gets deposited. And it protects the beaches. It keeps the erosion down. And so that's why the nicer beaches will almost always have a sandbar way out there, because it makes the waves lower and they're not as rough. But what happened here was they hit that away from the shore and ran aground. So the front of the boat, the bow, stuck fast. It slammed into it deep where it wouldn't move and would not move. And the stern broke to pieces by the pounding of the surf. And so it broke because the water was crashing on it. The one part was stuck, the other part was exposed, and the water was smashing on it, and it broke up the boat. So they're a good ways out. You don't want to swim, unless you're a really, really good swimmer, you don't really want to make that swim. It's usually far enough out there. That's a really tough swim. And so they're in trouble. The boat is breaking. And so in Acts 27:42, the soldiers planned to kill the prisoners to prevent any of them from swimming away and escaping. So in that moment, when the soldiers realized that the boat was going to break up into pieces and they were going to have to swim for it, they knew that somebody was going to have to swim in order to survive. They were getting ready to kill the prisoners. And the reason they wanted to kill the prisoners is because if any of the prisoners escaped, they would be killed. So we might as well kill the prisoners now to save our own lives twice, really. We save our lives because we don't, if they get away, we get killed. And it becomes easier to manage getting to shore if it's just me and I don't have to worry about prisoners. So they're getting ready to kill them all. And then in Acts 27:43-44, he says, But the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life and kept them from carrying out their plan. The prisoner, once again, has the ear of the leader of the soldiers. And the centurion, the leader, did not want to see Paul die. And so he talked his troops out of it. Remember, though, back earlier, Paul tells them, there's 276 of us on this boat. None of us will have a hair harmed on our heads. Right? Coming to fruition. And then he, the centurion, ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land. So prisoners could swim. Some could, some couldn't. Soldiers could swim, some could, some couldn't. He didn't differentiate which ones jump over. He says, anyone who can swim, jump in. And then 44, he says, the rest were to get there on planks or on other pieces of the ship. Now, that's an interesting story because that's not the true translation of it. The words that were actually used in Greek suggested not only could it be grab pieces of the broken ship, but it also suggested that they could be carried to shore by those that could swim, that they were grabbing shipmates and pulling them there to the land. And so the idea here is that both centurion and prisoner who could swim were assisting those who could not swim get to land. You know, I immediately thought of the Titanic when I hate the Titanic. I got to tell you, that movie makes my heart hurt because there was plenty of room up on that board for that boy to get up on that board with that girl at the end instead of him freezing to death in the water. But anyway, but that's what went into my head is that they grabbed the board and grabbed each other and they swam and assisted one another. And despite their differences, one being a prisoner, one being a soldier, and when God says it can happen, he uses what's available, be you friend or enemy, to do what it is that he said was going to be done. Paul is going to Rome. And there's 276 allies who are responsible for making sure that Paul gets to Rome. And so here we have that group of people doing what God is saying has to be done through Paul. Paul's telling them, you won't get hurt, do this, and they do it. It says, in this way, everyone reached the land safely. So the moral of the story, and I love this picture because this picture, that would be me trying to get there because I can swim, but boy, I would be trying to do it as easy as I could because that's a long swim. But really the moral of this story was that Paul, or the truth behind why this piece was laid out for us, is to understand that when God says something is going to happen, despite what comes up, despite the storm, despite being a prisoner, despite being on a boat in the middle of a storm, despite the boat crashing, despite the rule of thumb was to kill those who were prisoners, despite all that, God said, no, that's not the plan. This is my plan. And so he takes the most unsuspecting people to execute the plans that he has for us. I know I've talked a whole lot, but I'm at 41. Questions, anybody? Thoughts, questions? Anybody? Nobody? Let me see. None at all. Okay. All right. Then, Christy, if you can hear me, I'm going to pray. I'm going to get us out of